So it is my awesome pleasure to be on this call with some extraordinary men as human beings, as professionals in their craft, and as warriors, if I can use that term, Coach, as warriors for gun violence prevention, as we get close to what I am referring to as the end gun violence or the end mass killings elections of 2022. Some people call them the midterms. That term is confusing. It's demotivating. People think it's a quiz or a test that they don't really have to care about, but it is, in fact, one of the most important elections in our nation's history. Congressman, can you just address that on a large scale, how important this election is?
Yes, first, thank you for inviting me to be part of this, and it's a great thrill to be with Fred Guttenberg and Coach Kerr, two of my heroes, and two great champions of this work. Look, it's very simple. There is one political party in this country who is committed to enacting common sense gun legislation to reduce gun violence in America. And there's another political party in this country that is opposed to virtually every single piece of legislation to reduce gun violence. And it's Democrats who are fighting for gun violence safety. It's Republicans who have really become the wholly owned subsidiary of the gun lobby in this country, whose only interest is to sell more guns, to allow more guns to be in our communities. This is an epidemic in America. This is a peculiarly American problem. Gun violence is now the leading cause of death of America's children. The idea that we have more guns in America than people. So this notion of if there were just more guns, we'd be safer is a fallacy. If that were true, we'd be the safest country in the world. And the problem is it's too easy for people who shouldn't have a gun to get them. We have weapons of war, like assault weapons, that are readily available to people all across this country. They are the weapon of choice of the most despicable killers in America who do mass shootings in schools and synagogues and churches and shopping malls. And, President Obama used to say, we have to become single issue voters. The people who are opposed to common sense gun safety legislation, it's the only thing they care about is their guns. We have to be the same way in terms of gun safety. No one should vote for a candidate who is not committed to supporting common sense gun safety legislation in this country. If we do that, we can elect Democrats, hold the House, hold the Senate, and get those bills to the president's desk.
Got it. Steve Kerr, tell us why you are so passionate about this particular issue.
Well, I lost my dad when I was 18. He was 52 to gun violence. He was a victim of terrorism in the Middle East. And so I suffered at a pretty early age. My whole family suffered that loss. And so every time I read about whether it's a mass shooting or just anyone dying from gun violence, it hits home. And I don't read the statistics about how many people were killed. I think about all those families. I think about people like Fred Guttenberg. I think about the lives impacted because I've felt it myself. And so I think as I got older and as I realized I had a platform to use, I really tried to affiliate myself with some of the gun safety groups, people like groups like Brady and March for Our Lives and Sandy Hook Promise. There's a local group in Oakland that I do a lot of work with called Live Free. And I've learned so much about gun violence in our country. And what I've come to really believe is that there's so much we can do. And so I'm just trying to do my part. I feel like the election is a huge part of it. As the congressman just said, we have laws in place, we have votes in place, but we need to make sure that we have the people representing us who are going to fulfill our desires as a country. And so that's why it's so important for me to first be on with you guys today, but also to be here to encourage everybody to vote on this issue. To me, it's the biggest issue we have in this country. And there is a clear-cut impact from your vote to what eventually happens from a legal standpoint on gun violence in this country.
you have a question for the congressman?
Well, I think the thing that runs through my mind, Congressman, is I have to feel like you have colleagues on the Republican side who actually believe in some of the things that the Democratic side is proposing. But it feels to me like they are afraid to be expelled from their party, afraid to lose the next election. It feels to me like everything is at a standstill out of fear of the party reprisal against its own candidates. Is that true, or is that what's just I'm imagining in my head?
No, I think that's true. I mean, I think there's a lot of Republicans who are very afraid of not only the leadership of their party that has a well-stated opposition to any of these gun safety bills, and by the way, of course, is well financed by the gun lobby and its elections. So, they're afraid to put that at risk. But they're also afraid of many of their constituents who have views on some of these issues which are pretty extreme. The idea of there being no right to restrict in any way anyone's possession of any kind of firearm. It's simply not true. The Constitution does not authorize that, but people hide behind that. And rather than using their position as a position of leadership and making the case to their constituents about the necessity of common sense gun safety legislation and that reasonable restrictions that will keep the community safe are important. And rather than making the case that, well, you may have some rights and do have some rights under the Second Amendment to the Constitution, people also have the right to live and the right to live lives free of gun violence and the right to live with their children. You have a right to live with your father, Fred with his daughter. The idea that those rights to life, liberty, and the right to live lives free of gun violence are somehow secondary to the Constitution, the Second Amendment, is an absurdity. And so I think, what's disappointing to me is the unwillingness of people to stand up to the gun lobby and the money of the gun lobby to do what's right for their own constituents. And when people are putting their political future ahead of the lives of their constituents, they have forfeited the right to serve in public office, in my view. So if people are doing that, we need to vote them out of office. The most basic responsibility we have as elected officials is to do everything we can to keep people safe. And this scourge of gun violence is an epidemic, is destroying lives. When people like Coach Kerr and Fred are here, they're incredible champions, but they are also reliving their own experiences of having lost a child and lost a parent. So these are folks that are in a fight and they're willing to endure that pain to bring about change. The least we can do, the rest of us, is vote to bring about elected leaders who are willing to take these issues on and do the right thing. So, I think you've characterized some of my colleagues accurately. The good news is the American people are with us overwhelmingly. They support common sense gun safety legislation. They just have to be sure they understand what candidates are for that and what candidates are obstructing progress in this, and then vote accordingly.
So on that point, David, can you educate the country as to how many Republicans, let's be honest here, how many Republicans voted for your assault weapons ban, which recently passed the House of Representatives?
2, which means 215 or whatever voted against it. Now remember, the assault weapons ban was in effect. We had an assault weapons ban. There was a 25% reduction in mass shootings when the ban was in effect, a significant reduction in fatalities because the lethality of these weapons, they're designed to kill as many people as fast as you can. They were designed for the battlefield. They were not designed to be in neighborhoods and communities across this country. And they have characteristics which were specifically put on these weapons to make them easy to hide and especially deadly. Not for hunting, not for sport, but for military use. And so when that vote came up and we only got 2 Republicans, one of the Republicans, to the coach's earlier point, was drummed out of the Republican primary because he voted for express public support for the assault weapons ban. Now, I mean, this is a man who represented a district that had mass shooting in Buffalo. And he came out and said, I'm going to vote for an assault weapons ban. Thank God he did, because we needed his vote. But he was run out of the Republican primary and then shortly announced after that he would not seek re-election because he couldn't win. And so this is how extreme the Republican Party has become on that issue. But we were lucky in the House. We were able to pass it. I and others worked very hard to make sure we had the votes because we wanted to put people on the record. Even though we knew we didn't have the votes in the Senate, we want voters to know who's for banning those weapons and who's not. And right now we can't get it through the Senate because of the filibuster. But if we can elect 2 more Democrats, we can get rid of the filibuster and get that assault weapons ban to the president's desk where he is anxious to sign it.
So, David, before I go to Fred, what are the chances that your assault weapons ban bill would even be brought up or pass if Kevin McCarthy and the Republicans pick up 5 more seats and take over the majority?
0. If the Republicans take over the House and Kevin McCarthy becomes the Speaker of the House, they will not put any gun safety legislation on the floor. They absolutely will not put the assault weapons ban on the floor. In fact, my guess is they will go back and try to repeal some of the progress we've made. They'll try to, again, ban research on gun violence. They will probably try to roll back some of the things we did in the legislation we passed this year because they are beholden to the gun lobby. Look, follow the money. Look who finances the Republican candidates for the Congress and the Senate, the NRA and the gun lobby. Those are the people that have the A+ ratings. People like me get an F proudly. And so there is 0 chance that we will take any action to reduce gun violence in America so long if the Republicans take control of the House. 0.
And if, God forbid, but if Ron DeSantis or another Republican replaces Joe Biden in the White House, what are the chances that that Republican president would sign the assault weapons ban bill if you did get Congress back in 2 years?
0 chance. There is no way. They are running campaigns where they proudly oppose the assault weapons ban, where they proudly oppose any limitations on anyone having a firearm. This is a party, by the way, that still has not passed universal background checks. This is very effective. Millions and millions of people who should not be permitted to buy a gun because they're either a danger, a criminal, has some other disqualifying characteristic, they've been denied the purchase of a firearm. That's good news. The problem is there are many, many gun sales which happen without a background check because they're bought at gun shows or they're bought online. And so this closes that to make sure that everyone has a background check, supported by 95% of the American people, including gun owners. They won't even pass that. Why? Because the gun lobby, which is really gun manufacturers, they don't want any limitations on guns. They want to be able to sell as many as they can to make as much money as they can. And so the Republicans in the Senate won't even pass universal background checks, supported by 95% of the American people. That tells you about the corrupting influence of money in our political system.
So just to get the math right, unless we hold the House in this election so that you can bring up the assault weapons ban and a Democratic majority can pass it again, and unless we hold the Senate and pick up 2 more senators, Democratic senators, who can create a carve out to the filibuster, it's possible if we lose the White House for the next 8 years, it's possible that we will not be able to ban assault weapons for at least 10 years or more. Is that
Correct.
accurate?
That's exactly right.
So now is our chance. Now is the closest chance we have to finally get this thing that the vast majority of Americans want. And let's go to Fred. Speaking of assault weapons, we're talking to somebody who has suffered a personal hell because of these weapons. Fred, tell us what you shared before we went live about the fact that you finally got some sleep.
Well, this week, for the first time, I slept through the night the past 2 nights because the trial for the killer of my daughter and 16 others in the Parkland school shooting finally concluded. My daughter was on the 3rd floor of her school building, and someone came in with an AR-15 and killed 17 and wounded 17 others. I want to kind of go back, though, to 2003, the year this beautiful baby was born, my daughter, Jamie. Life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. That's the promise she was born into. And in 2004, the assault weapons ban ended. And unfortunately, you can follow the line. In 2018, My daughter was killed. But here's the thing. Her murder was predictable. The next one is inevitable because you can go back to Sandy Hook and the others before it. Nothing changed. Nothing got done. So why would we expect that my daughter wouldn't eventually get killed? Why would we expect Uvalde wouldn't happen? Because we haven't taken the necessary steps. And so I want to really just say thank you to Steve and David for the discussion before on voting and elections. Because here's where I'm at. If you go back to 2018, the year that this happened, we voted in a Democratic Congress. We flipped it on this issue. No one's going to tell me otherwise. And if you go to 2020, we put a Senate in charge by Democrats, Majority Leader Schumer, and we elected President Biden. Our vote had a consequence for this issue. We passed legislation. We got it done. If you fast forward now, today's Friday. What is it, 4 or 5 days from now, there's going to be another vote. And we're seeing record turnout around the country. Here's the thing about the vote that's coming up. Unfortunately, I would say about a third of the country has become radicalized. I don't think that's an unreasonable number. That radicalized portion of the country, they're voting. They're getting out and voting. They're not sitting home. But there is a vast majority of the country. There are more of us that are made up of Democrats, independents, and Republicans who could no longer stomach being a part of that Republican Party, who are aligned with where we are right now. But will they vote? That is the question. If they show up and vote, if they watch this and they get inspired to vote because they recognize it doesn't have to be this way, we'll be okay. But will they vote? There's more of us. There are more like-minded, reasonable people who want to see our children, our parents, our neighbors, our cousins, our friends be safe. But will they vote?
So I want to go to you, Steve. You have millions and millions of people who love and respect you and follow you and, of course, follow your team who are not going to vote. Can you explain that? And what would be your words to those people?
I think my words to those people, Richard, would be, there was a time in my life where I didn't vote in the midterms because I didn't think they were that important. When I was a new voter, the midterms would come and pass and I go, oh, I forgot, and it didn't strike me that it was that big of a deal. Now, this was a time when the country was much less divided. So maybe the urgency for voters wasn't there. Maybe turnout wasn't as much because we all felt a little safer. But what I've realized as I've gotten older is every vote matters. Every election matters because of what we've just heard from Fred and from the congressman in terms of the impact, the domino effect of every single election and what we're capable of from a legislative standpoint based on the results of these elections. So I think one of you mentioned early in this conversation that, being a single issue voter can be a really good thing because sometimes you go into the booth and it's overwhelming. You've got all this information in front of you. Who do I vote for? I've got to do my information. I got to run, do my background research. But if there's an issue that really stands out for you, like it does for all of us on this panel, it becomes a lot easier to say, number one, I got to go vote because I know this matters. And number two, I know who to vote for because we literally have an entire party that is committed to gun violence reduction and gun safety. So common sense gun safety measures. So it simplifies the process.
Do you think, Steve, that the people who are not voting, who perhaps love you and follow you, have any idea about the statistic that David just gave, that every single Democrat voted to ban assault weapons in this country so that people like Fred, there would not be more people like Fred who have to suffer unbelievable hell?
Richard, you muted yourself somehow. There you go.
That the other party has voted almost unanimously against it. Do you think people understand that?
I think some people do. I don't think everyone does. And so I think it's important to continue to reiterate. And there are so many statistics, working with Brady. Brady has a great program that's called End Family Fire. There's a horrifying stat that 9 children in America are shot each day by unsecured weapons in homes, just accidents. And so Brady is trying to pass a law and pass legislation that would require gun owners to lock up their own guns to protect their children. Who can't support that, right? I mean, who can't support that? It's a rhetorical question, but in many cases, if you want to actually answer it, it's Republican candidates won't support that because they won't support anything. As Fred,
they've actually voted against that.
Voted against that. So what we're dealing with is so insane, and it's been mentioned several times, but regardless of party affiliation, 90% of us, over 90% of us in this country want universal background checks. We're not being represented by the people who are going to Washington to supposedly do so. And so the only thing we can do is to go in and vote and to encourage others to vote as well.
So I just want to address one thing. I was actually on a podcast and we were talking about banning assault weapons, and the right-wing host of this podcast said, if they come for my AR-15, there's going to be war. We're going to be out in the streets. No one's going to take my guns away from me, not you liberal Democrats, right? How do you answer that, David?
Well, first of all, the assault weapons ban that was passed in 1994 and the assault weapons ban that the House passed doesn't seize a single firearm. And so it bans the additional production and distribution of assault weapons so that we can ultimately rid our communities of these weapons. So that's just not true. No one's coming to take anyone's gun away. We're simply stopping the additional infusion of these weapons of war. And hopefully over time, the ones that are in circulation will become degraded and unuseful, and eventually we will live in a country free of weapons of war in our communities. But this slippery slope argument is the same argument that Republicans make against any gun safety legislation, even universal background checks. Their argument is the same. If you allow any restriction or any limitation or any common sense gun safety measures to become law, the next thing is they're coming for your gun. That's their talking point. It is not true, but it is a way that they have persuaded the Republicans to resist any. I mean, I'll give you an example. Right now, if you're a licensed gun dealer and you break the law, you sell guns to criminals and terrorists, and you have your license revoked, you can sell your inventory to anyone you want without a background check under current law. So I introduced a very simple bill. If you're a federally licensed gun dealer or your license is revoked, you can only sell your inventory to another federally licensed gun dealer. Seems simple, right? The gun lobby opposes even that. And so literally you can have your license revoked for wrongdoing, and then the inventory is deemed your personal collection because you're not a licensed gun dealer anymore, and you can sell it to anyone you want without a background check. That's lunacy. But it's just an example of how extreme the gun lobby's positions are, and frankly, the position of the Republican Party. they have been in lockstep. They have opposed every single measure. And you were talking about the importance of voting. John Lewis, my late colleague, said, the right to vote is sacred and precious and the single most powerful non-violent tool to bring about change. If you live in America and you really want to do something to change the epidemic of gun violence, the most powerful tool you have is your vote. Use it. Make sure that you can honor the lives of that we have lost to gun violence by doing everything you can. At the very minimum, vote for people who are committed to passing common sense gun safety legislation, and throw people out of office who put their own political futures ahead of the lives of the people that they were elected to serve.
Okay,
Richard,
I want to start to wrap this up. Fred, go ahead, Fred.
Yeah, no, listen, I got to say something, because I'm actually, in the spring, I've got a book called American Carnage coming out, which addresses all of these myths and puts out the truth. And in fact, I'm honored to say Coach Kerr is writing the foreword for the book. But here's the thing about AR-15s, and I think back to when Jamie was killed. You were horrified when you saw one, right? Now they show up at marches and rallies, and we're supposed to consider that normal. The evolution of this normalizing of this weapon can be traced back to 2008 and the Heller decision, because the Heller decision developed a term called common use. You've all heard that term. It is now the defense that they all use for that weapon in the arguments and in the hearings that you held, Congressman. And common use basically says if a weapon is in common use at the time, it is protected. The thing is, in 2008, it wasn't. It wasn't. Following the Heller decision, the gun manufacturers went on a business strategy of flooding our streets and flooding our homes and flooding our communities with these weapons. They weren't developing for sport or hunting. They were developing as many as they can, marketing them to as many people as they could, including children. And here we are today. It is the reason why I want PLACA repealed, because I want to be inside of those business meetings going back to 2008 to understand how we got here today. So don't let anybody give you that BS. This was a business strategy that brought us to where we are today, and we can't let that business strategy keep on killing our kids.
Fred, wow, beautifully put. Steve, any last things you want to say, or any questions you have for Fred or David?
Well, I think it's important for everybody out there to educate themselves on these issues. And one thing I like to recommend to people is there was a New York Times Magazine piece written maybe 7 or 8 years ago, comparing the gun industry to the auto industry. And it was maybe the best metaphor I've ever seen for the possibilities of reducing gun violence in this country. And I'll try to be brief, but basically we had 90% more auto deaths 50 years ago than we have today. So we've reduced deaths on the highways and roads by 90%. Well, how do we do that? Driver's training, speed limits, registration, seat belts, the child seats. We got smart, right? We as a country, we thought, okay, how can we save lives? And these are all the steps we took. 90%. Think how many lives were saved because of the seatbelt campaign. Think how many lives were saved just by the introduction of the child seat, strapping your child in the back seat and keeping them safe. I mean, we're talking millions of lives that were saved by really simple common sense legislation. The exact same thing can happen with gun violence. If we had gun registration and gun safety training requirements for people who want to buy guns, why wouldn't we do that? We ask our 16-year-old kids to take driver's training to keep them safe. Anybody who owns a gun should probably have gun safety training. My point is there are so many common sense measures that would not take away people's Second Amendment rights that are just sitting there for us as a country to adopt and as voters to vote for. And if we implement them, we're going to save millions of lives. And that life may be your daughters, your fathers, your sibling, your aunt, uncle, your best friend. What more important issue could there possibly be that would get you to go to the polls? So I recommend you look that up. It's easy to find. If you Google it, that article, and really start to learn more about this issue, because it really is a public health issue. And it's one that we can address with common sense thinking and unity, but we got to get there.
Yeah. Well, and you've been such an incredible warrior for this common sense gun safety movement that we have. Fred, any questions or last comments?
My only last comment is the last two elections proved our vote can make a difference in a positive way for safety, for decency, civility, for the benefit of all Americans. Don't sit this one out, because this one is even more important than the last two. So if you haven't voted yet, make sure you do so. If you know someone who hasn't voted yet, make sure they do so. If you're not sure, call the 10, 20, 30 people closest to you and ask them. And if they need help getting to the polls, or if they need any support whatsoever, make sure they vote. This is the election of our lifetime coming up.
David, let me ask you a quick question, because there are so many young people especially say, well, I live in California. I live in a blue state. I don't need to vote. I live in New York. I live in Illinois, whatever. Isn't it true that the entire issue that we've been talking about could be decided by one House seat in California or New York or Illinois, and by 50 or 100 or even one vote, because young people go, it's the midterms, it doesn't fucking matter, I'm staying home, I'm in a blue state? Can you address that? That literally every single one of the 435 House seats could be the one to either give the majority to Kevin McCarthy or Donald Trump, I think he might be speaker, or allow us to continue to do this work and possibly make it happen.
Look, I think you are absolutely right. We're living in a time where our country is deeply divided along party lines, and we live in a country where there are races all across America, really close races, more toss-up, tied races maybe than at any time, at least in my lifetime. And, we could win or lose the House by a seat, by one race. And so there is nobody in America who should feel comfortable sitting at home thinking it's all going to take care of itself without me. It's just not the case. The consequences of who controls the House in particular, because in the House, the majority party, the Speaker of the House, really has the power to decide what bills come to the floor, what bills never see the light of day, regardless of what the rest of the body thinks. That's the Speaker's prerogative. And the determination as to whether or not that Speaker is Kevin McCarthy or the Democratic candidate will determine whether or not we take up any gun violence legislation. And as Coach Kerr said, this is a public health crisis. We ought to look at it through the lens of public health. In any other example, this would be an urgent public health crisis because the level of violence and death that results from gun violence is so great. We have too many families all across this country who have had to deal with the devastating loss of someone they love in a second because of gun violence. And we can do something about this. This is all preventable. We have really good strategies, lots of excellent legislation, but we will not get those bills to the president's desk if we lose the House. And so every single person has a moral responsibility to participate in our democracy if we're going to hold on to it, and to be sure that you understand who you're voting for and whether they're on your side. We have great gun safety organizations like the Brady Campaign, Everytown, March for Our Lives, and so many others who do a spectacular job of collecting information on where candidates stand, what their records are, what their public statements are. So it's easy to get information to be sure you make the right and a well-informed decision. But the lives of your friends and your family and your neighbors are at stake. If we don't do something, no one can be confident that, God forbid, you or a member of your family or one of your neighbors will next be a victim of gun violence in this country. And it will be a very uncomfortable moment if you think, I could have done something about that. If only I had taken the time to vote for someone who would fix this problem, maybe that life could have been saved. Don't live with that. Make sure you vote.
So last point, you talked about single issue voters. So maybe gun violence prevention is not the biggest thing for someone watching this. Isn't it also true that codifying Roe v. Wade, that protecting same-sex marriage, protecting the right to contraception, equal pay for women, decriminalizing marijuana federally, all of those bills and so many more, Katie Porter's anti-price gouging bill, all of those bills that passed the House, not one of them will even be brought up in the House for a vote, and therefore impossible to become law if Republicans win 5 more seats in the House or 1 more seat in the Senate. Is that an accurate statement?
Absolutely, completely accurate, which is why not only for gun violence prevention, but for all those issues you just described, holding on to our freedom to make our own healthcare decisions, to our freedom to live lives free from gun violence, to our freedom to marry the person we love. All of these important freedoms that we've come to enjoy in this country are on the ballot. There's one political party committed to protecting them. There's another political party working hard to take them away. And that's why you have to vote in this election.
Got it. Thank you, gentlemen. It's been such an honor. I am a total fan of all 3 of you. David, seriously, I study this stuff really, really hard. And for a long time, I've taught civics for a long time. You are the best legislator in America. And you're sitting next to one of the best coach in basketball, go Dubs, and one of the finest human beings I've ever met. Fred Gutenberg.
Yeah.
Thank you, gentlemen. Thanks so much. We'll
Thank
talk
you.
soon. Everybody
care,
vote,
guys.
and let's celebrate on Wednesday.
Yeah.
Take care.
Yeah.
Thank you, guys.
Thanks.